to let all the world know that Jesus saves. Raise a shout to let all the world know that Jesus saves.
When a crisis crashes into your life, do you murmur, complain? Do you run away? Do you check out? Are you like Winnie the Pooh, or the Winnie the Pooh character, Eeyore? How many kids know who Eeyore is? Eeyore. Oh, you know Eeyore, okay. He's always whining, and it's always raining, and miserable life existence, no hope. It kind of reminds me of this card I received once, and it said, when you see the light at the end of the tunnel, be careful, it's probably a train coming after you. This resurrection morning, I would like to offer you hope and optimism that is found not in positive thinking or slogans like, don't worry, be happy, but rather in the resurrection of Jesus Christ. I like to quote my daughter Sarah, who's in Spain. She's always saying, Jesus is still king. The focus of this morning's message will be a familiar character, not too unlike Eeyore. You may remember him as Doubting Thomas. Let's turn our Bibles to John chapter 20, verses 26 and following. Actually 24 following. Now Thomas, called the twin, one of the 12, was not with them when Jesus came. The other disciples therefore said to him, we have seen the Lord. So he said to them, unless I see in his hands the print of the nails, and put my finger into the print of the nails, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe. And after 8 days his disciples were again inside, and Thomas with them. Jesus came, the doors being shut, and stood in the midst and said, peace to you. Then he said to Thomas, reach your finger here and look at my hands, and reach your hand here and put it into my side. Do not be unbelieving, but believing. And Thomas answered and said to him, my Lord and my God. Jesus said to him, Thomas, because you have believed me, because you have seen me, have you believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believed. And truly Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. In order to set the stage for this event, it would be helpful if we would summarize the events leading to this. In the Gospel of John's account, Jesus appears to Mary Magdalene, the 11 disciples, and also to Thomas. In other accounts, we can trace a total of 10 appearances, but each has a unique need that seems to be met in the Gospel of John. Mary, who is weeping and sorrowful, is offered comfort. Peter, who is overwhelmed with guilt, is given forgiveness. If you recall the angel saying, go tell disciples and Peter, that extra emphasis there was probably a good plus for Peter. John was probably in a lot of despair, being the closest to Jesus, and this event gives him hope. The disciples, who were all fearful, are now experiencing gladness. And finally, we see Thomas, who is doubtful, and he's about to engage in a newfound faith. We know very little about Thomas, but we do know something. We know that Thomas was a bit pessimistic, although a bit unfairly, he has been dubbed the doubter of the apostles, or the disciples. But in Matthew, it says that some doubted. In Mark, it says they were rebuked for unbelief. In Luke, it says that they were all did not believe. So it's not always a focus on just Thomas that has this problem. But it's clear that Thomas was indeed doubtful as we look into this account. We also know that he was loyal. If you look at John 11, John 11, verse 8, it reads, the disciples said to him, Rabbi, lately the Jews sought to go to stone you, and you're going there again? He was going to go back into Judea. Jesus answered, are there not 12 hours in the day? If any walks in the day, he does not stumble, because he sees the light of this world. But if one walks in the night, he stumbles because the light is not in him. These things he said, and after that he said to them, Our friend Lazarus sleeps, but I go that I may wake him up. And his disciples said, Lord, if he sleeps, he will get well. However, Jesus spoke of his death, but they thought that he was speaking about taking rest and sleep. Then Jesus said to them plainly, Lazarus is dead, and I am glad for your sakes that I was not there, that you may believe. Nevertheless, let us go to him. And then here's where we get coming. Then Thomas, who is called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, Let us also go, that we may die with him. Although pessimistic and always looking at the worst, he had a sense of loyalty that is admirable. His willingness to die with Christ shows a sense of courage that can only be considered exemplary. He was also inquisitive. In John 14:6, when Jesus says, I am the way and the truth and life, he's the one that stirs up the questions like, how can we know the way? How can we know where you're going? His loyalty caused him to want to be with Jesus. I personally can relate to someone who is both loyal and likes to ask inquisitive questions. Ever since I was a young teenager, I was annoying to people because I would ask them questions. And one of my favorite slogans or introductions was, what would you do if? And it was very annoying to my teenage friends because I came with all these concoctions. What would you do if this? And I was very annoying. But I was always inquisitive and liked to see what's going on in people's heads and how they would react. And as I got older and grew up and got away from that silly question, I created a new one. And if anybody knows me well, they've probably heard me say this a time or two. On a scale from 1 to 10, what would you do or how would you feel about this? And my family gets kind of annoyed, I think, of the preponderance of these questions. So I can relate to Thomas being inquisitive. And also a sense of loyalty. I just identify with his loyalty because I'm a kind of a people person. I just kind of peopleless to a fault. I remember my friend Bob at the firehouse said, if you become friends with Charlie, you're stuck for life. And it's like, I don't know, I just can't get away from him. So I can relate to Thomas being this inquisitive and loyal person. We also understand from history and tradition that he was probably martyred. In Fox's Book of Martyrs, it's recorded that he was driven through with a spear. Think that through for a second, because that's going to come up later. Probably driven through with a spear. Also, Thomas seemed a bit melancholy. He was not with the other disciples, but probably alone, down the dumps, moping, depressed, maybe more so than any of them. He strikes me the kind of person that would prefer to be alone rather than be in a crowd in times of despair. And finally, we also know him that he was a twin. Not sure how that affected his growing years, and not trying to be overly psychological about this, but it would make an interesting study to think about what it's like being a twin, especially an identical twin. Although I've never had a twin, people used to get me confused with my brother Mike. Whenever he would come up here and play the guitar, afterwards people would come up to me all the time and say, that was a really good job. Yeah. But I wasn't Mike. Sometimes people ask me about Amanda and Sarah if they were twins. They were younger probably, but I always say no. And they would even ask Josh if they were twins, but they don't say that so much since contacts and facial hair came into being. But back in the day, they would get them confused. So there was this sense of, although I never had twins, I feel like I've had two pairs. I can remember a strange story when I had a neighbor next door that didn't know my family, but just from a distance. But she thought I only had two kids, a boy and a girl, because she sat there and would see his window, and they take turns practicing the piano. And Josh would go in there, and Miranda would go in there, and Amanda's there. But she would just think it was Josh and Anna was always just one boy, and Sarah and Amanda was just one girl. And so she was shocked one day when I came out and all four of these kids were there. And later she told me, I didn't know you had four kids because they looked alike to her. So that's the closest I got to twins. The only twin I ever knew in real life was a fellow by the name of Dwight. He was a colonel in the Air Force when I was a young man, a sergeant. He was a lieutenant, a believer. He influenced me to go to Bible college. We were great friends. He has since died of cancer, pancreatic cancer. But I remember him telling me what it was like having a twin. He said, you always had a friend, but you also had a rivalry. And he said, and paused, a rivalry that continues to this day.